What historians now describe as the discovery that fundamentally altered our understanding of American founding principles began beneath the floorboards of a cash-strapped single mother's colonial-era home in rural Massachusetts, all set in motion by one woman's relentless quest to provide stability for her family during financial hardship. A chance finding that would eventually bring academic delegations to her doorstep, trigger emergency meetings at the Smithsonian, and ultimately rewrite sections of history textbooks across the nation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wooden steps groaned under Sarah Mitchell's weight as she descended into the cellar, armed with a flashlight in one hand and a pry bar in the other. At 42, the single mother of twin daughters had become surprisingly adept at home renovation, a skill born from necessity rather than choice. 2 years after her ex-husband walked out on their 15-year marriage, her income as an elementary school librarian barely covered the mortgage on the 1780s colonial home that had seemed like such a steal during the foreclosure auction. The house, nestled in the historic town of Burnfield, Massachusetts, had been constructed in 1783 and had clearly weathered nearly 2.5 centuries of New England seasons before Sarah had scraped together her life savings and a loan from her parents for the down payment. The bank officer had enthusiastically described it as a piece of living history with incredible investment potential. Words that Sarah now recognized as code for requires constant repairs and contains unpleasant surprises behind every wall. Today's project focused on clearing out the cellar to create a usable storage space. The previous owners had left behind decades of accumulated junk, old furniture, broken appliances, and stacks of deteriorating cardboard boxes that had begun to take on that distinct musty cellar smell. Sarah had promised herself that by summer's end, this space would be clean, organized, and properly insulated. "Mom, did you find anything cool yet?" called her daughter Lily from the top of the stairs, her voice echoing against the fieldstone foundation walls. "Just someone's abandoned hobby equipment and about 50 years' worth of National Geographics," Sarah replied, shining her flashlight toward a particularly precarious stack of yellowing magazines. "How's that history assignment coming along?" I'm stuck. Revolutionary War primary sources are impossible to find online without a subscription," Lily complained. "And Emma's hogging the laptop." "I am not," came the indignant reply from Sarah's other daughter, somewhere in the house above. "I'm trying to finish my college application essay." Sarah smiled despite her exhaustion. At 17, her girls were opposites in almost every way. Emma, the meticulous planner, already laser-focused on college. Lily, the creative free spirit who approached deadlines as loose suggestions. Yet they both shared their mother's stubborn determination, a trait that had kept the family afloat through the turmoil of the past few years. "I'll be up to help in a bit," Sarah called back. "Just need to clear this corner so I can assess the moisture problem." As Lily's footsteps retreated, Sarah turned her attention to a stack of warped wooden crates in the far corner. The cellar had a persistent dampness issue that seemed worst in that area, and she suspected poor drainage around the foundation. As she began moving the crates, she noticed something odd about the flooring beneath them. Unlike the packed dirt that made up most of the cellar floor, this section appeared to be covered with old wooden planks that didn't match the construction style of the rest of the house. "That's strange," she murmured, kneeling to examine the boards more closely. The wood looked older than the surrounding structure, with hand-forged nails, rather than the machine-cut nails used in the home's construction. Sarah's interest was piqued. During the purchase process, the real estate agent had mentioned that the house was built on the foundation of an earlier structure that had burned down during the Revolutionary War period, but Sarah had assumed that meant just the stone foundation walls. She ran her fingers along the edges of the boards, feeling a distinct gap where one section seemed to meet another. Using the pry bar, she gently prodded the edge of one board, which gave slightly, suggesting it wasn't fully secured to the supporting structure below. Her curiosity now fully engaged, Sarah wedged the pry bar into the gap and applied gentle pressure. The board lifted slightly, revealing darkness beneath. With growing excitement, Sarah worked methodically, carefully removing one plank and then another until she had opened a roughly 3-foot square in the floor. Her flashlight beam revealed not dirt as she had expected, but what appeared to be a small storage space about 2 feet deep, lined with stone and containing what looked like a wooden box or chest. "What in the world?" she whispered, aiming her flashlight for a better view. The chest was approximately 2 feet long and perhaps 18 inches wide, constructed of dark wood bound with tarnished metal straps. It appeared remarkably well preserved, protected from moisture by the sealed space and the layer of planking above. Sarah's mind raced with possibilities: old family heirlooms, household items from a bygone era, or perhaps just someone's forgotten storage. The past 2 years had taught Sarah resilience she never knew she possessed. The divorce had left her emotionally drained and financially vulnerable, with 2 teenage daughters depending entirely on her. Friends had questioned her decision to purchase the dilapidated colonial rather than a sensible modern apartment, but Sarah had been determined to provide her daughters with stability, a permanent home, with history and character in a good school district where they could put down roots despite their father's absence. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The house had been affordable precisely because of its condition, a condition that required constant attention. Weekends that might have been spent relaxing were instead filled with painting, repairs, and learning basic construction skills through YouTube tutorials and borrowed library books. The cellar renovation represented her latest attempt to create more functional space in the cramped home, storage for seasonal decorations, winter clothes, and the girl's childhood mementos that she couldn't bear to discard. Setting the flashlight aside to illuminate the space, Sarah reached down and attempted to lift the chest. It was surprisingly heavy, requiring both hands and considerable effort to raise it from its hiding place. With a grunt of exertion, she finally managed to lift it clear and set it on the cellar floor beside the opening. Up close, the craftsmanship of the chest was evident. The wood appeared to be walnut, with dovetail joinery at the corners and decorative metal strapping that, despite tarnish and age, showed signs of once having been quite ornate. There was no lock, only a simple metal latch mechanism that had become stiff with age and disuse. Sarah hesitated, suddenly aware that she was about to open something that had remained sealed, possibly for centuries. A fanciful part of her brain wondered if this was how archaeologists felt before opening an untouched tomb, a mixture of excitement, reverence, and the nagging sense of intruding on something meant to stay hidden. Pushing aside such thoughts, she carefully worked the latch mechanism until it finally gave way with a rusty groan. Slowly, she lifted the lid, which resisted briefly before yielding with a soft creak of ancient hinges. The contents were not what she had expected. No family silver or heirloom jewelry, no antique toys or household implements. Instead, the chest contained what appeared to be documents, stacks of papers, folded pamphlets, and several bound journals, all remarkably well preserved despite their obvious age. Sarah lifted out one of the documents with careful hands. The paper was thick and had a distinct texture that modern paper lacked. The handwriting was elegant, but difficult to decipher, a flowing script in faded brown ink. The date at the top, however, was clear enough: April 19th, 1775. "The day the Revolutionary War began," Sarah whispered, her librarian's knowledge of American history immediately placing the significance of the date. The document appeared to be a letter, but the formal language and archaic sentence structure made it difficult to understand at a glance. She set it aside gently and examined another paper. This one dated July 1783, the year her house was supposedly built. This document was clearer, appearing to be some sort of inventory or record-keeping, with columns of names and figures. As she carefully examined more of the contents, Sarah realized she was looking at what appeared to be a collection of private correspondence, journals, and records spanning from just before the Revolutionary War through the early formation of the United States. Some documents bore names she recognized from history books, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, while others were signed by people she'd never heard of. "Mom, are you coming up?" Emma's voice called down the stairs, startling Sarah from her absorption. "In the documents. I'll be right there," she responded, suddenly reluctant to share her discovery until she better understood what she had found. "Just finishing up something." Sarah carefully returned the documents to the chest, closed the lid, and decided to move it upstairs, where she could examine the contents more thoroughly in better light. The chest was heavy but manageable, and she carried it up to her bedroom, concealing it in her closet before going to help her daughters with their respective projects. That evening, after the girls had gone to bed, Sarah retrieved the chest and began a more methodical examination of its contents. Spreading the documents carefully across her bed, she used her phone to photograph some of the more legible pages, then attempted to decipher the handwriting and archaic language. One journal in particular caught her attention. The leather-bound volume contained what appeared to be personal reflections of someone who had been present at several key events during the Revolutionary period. The writer identified himself as Thomas Fielding, a name Sarah didn't recognize from her knowledge of history, but who apparently had been some sort of clerk or secretary with connections to several founding fathers. As she read more closely, certain passages jumped out with startling clarity. Though it shall never be publicly acknowledged, our break from England was motivated not solely by lofty ideals of liberty, but by the private financial interests of those who stood to profit most from independence. I record this truth here, in private, though to speak it aloud would brand me traitor to the cause. And later, the compromise reached today regarding representation was not, as will be reported, primarily about balancing power between large and small states, but rather about ensuring certain economic arrangements beneficial to particular delegates would remain protected under the new system. I transcribed the official minutes as directed, omitting these discussions as instructed. Sarah's heart began to race as the implications of these writings became clear. If authentic, these documents represented a private, unfiltered perspective on the founding of the nation, one that contradicted, or at least complicated, the traditional historical narrative taught in schools. Another document, appearing to be a letter from 1787, referenced the true Articles of Confederation and mentioned a supplementary agreement that was not included in the official documents but was binding upon the signatory parties and their heirs. The letter referred to specific provisions regarding banking structures and financial obligations between certain states that Sarah had never encountered in any history book. As a librarian with a lifelong love of history, Sarah recognized the potential significance of what she had discovered. These documents, if legitimate, could represent an important historical find, private perspectives, and possibly records of unofficial agreements that shaped the nation's founding, but had been deliberately excluded from the official narrative. But another part of her, the practical single mother, recognized the potential complications of such a find. The house had been in foreclosure, which raised questions about who might legally claim ownership of items found within it. Additionally, historic artifacts often fell under various preservation laws and regulations. After several hours of examination, Sarah carefully returned the documents to the chest, her mind racing with questions. Should she contact a historian? A museum? Would doing so potentially jeopardize her ownership of these materials? Would anyone even believe they were authentic rather than elaborate forgeries? Deciding she needed more information before proceeding, Sarah turned to the internet, searching for information on authenticating historical documents and the legal status of found artifacts. The search results were overwhelming and often contradictory, with various state and federal regulations potentially applying depending on the nature and significance of the find. One website, belonging to the Massachusetts Historical Society, seemed most relevant. It outlined procedures for reporting significant historical discoveries and emphasized the importance of proper authentication and preservation. The site noted that while finders might not retain ownership of certain categories of historical artifacts, they were often credited with the discovery and might even receive compensation in some cases. Sarah also searched for information about Thomas Fielding, the apparent author of the most revealing journal, but found nothing definitive about anyone by that name connected to the Founding Fathers or Revolutionary period. This could either mean the journal was fraudulent, or that Fielding was indeed a minor figure whose perspectives had been lost to history, until now. After bookmarking several promising resources, Sarah finally went to bed well after midnight, her mind still buzzing with the possibilities her discovery represented. The chest and its contents, potentially documenting a more complex and less idealistic version of America's founding than the one taught in schools, had been hidden for more than 2 centuries. Now they had emerged into a world that might not be ready for their revelations. The next morning, over breakfast, Sarah debated whether to tell her daughters about her discovery. As a parent, she had always encouraged their intellectual curiosity and critical thinking, but she also worried about involving them in something that could become complicated, especially with Emma's college applications in progress and Lily's already difficult relationship with historical study. "You look tired, Mom," Emma observed, pouring herself a bowl of cereal. "Were you up late working on the cellar again?" "Something like that," Sarah replied, deciding to keep the discovery to herself for now. "I've found some interesting old things that need sorting through." "More National Geographics?" Lily asked with a grimace. "Because we really don't need those for my history project." Sarah smiled. "No, just some old papers. Nothing exciting." The lie felt strange on her tongue, but she reasoned it was temporary, just until she could determine the best course of action. After sending the girls off to school, Sarah called in sick to the library, something she rarely did. But this felt like an exceptional circumstance. Once alone in the house, she returned to the chest and continued her examination of the documents, this time with more focus and organization. She created a basic inventory, noting dates, apparent authors, and brief descriptions of content for each document. The collection spanned from 1774 to 1796, covering the Revolutionary War, the Constitutional Convention, and the early years of the new government. Some appeared to be official or semi-official in nature, while others were clearly private correspondence and personal reflections. The most intriguing items continued to be Thomas Fielding's journals, which provided commentary on events from the perspective of someone present, but not among the recognized leaders. Fielding described himself as a humble recorder of great men's words, but his private opinions were anything but humble, offering sharp insights and occasionally scathing critiques of the motivations and character of various founding fathers. By midday, Sarah had reached a decision. She needed expert assistance to determine the authenticity and significance of these documents, but wanted to approach someone who would take her seriously and not immediately attempt to claim the materials. for an institution. After careful consideration, she decided to contact Professor Eliza Montgomery at Burnfield College, a well-respected historian who had written several books on the Revolutionary period and whom Sarah had met at various library events. Sarah composed a careful email describing her discovery in general terms and asking for a confidential consultation. She emphasized that she was not yet ready to go public with the find, but needed expert guidance on authentication and preservation. She attached several photographs of the less controversial documents as examples. Within an hour, she received an enthusiastic reply. Professor Montgomery expressed keen interest and suggested meeting as soon as possible, preferably that same day. The professor's rapid response and eagerness confirmed Sarah's sense that her discovery might indeed be significant. They arranged to meet at Sarah's home late that afternoon, after the girls would be occupied with their after-school activities. This would give Sarah time to prepare, organizing the documents for efficient review and considering what questions she needed to ask. As the appointed time approached, Sarah found herself growing increasingly nervous. The reality of sharing her discovery with someone else, especially an expert who might immediately recognize its significance or, conversely, identify it as a worthless forgery, made the situation suddenly more real. At precisely 4 o'clock, a gentle knock came at the front door. Professor Montgomery was a slight woman in her early 60s with silver-streaked dark hair and piercing blue eyes that radiated intelligence. She carried a leather satchel and wore what Sarah recognized as archival gloves already in her hands. Clearly, she had taken the email seriously enough to come prepared. "Ms. Mitchell, thank you for contacting me," the professor said after introductions. "From the images you sent, I'm very intrigued by what you've discovered." "Ta-da! Thank you for coming so quickly," Sarah replied, leading her to the dining room, where she had carefully arranged some of the documents on acid-free paper she'd borrowed from the library's archives. "I'm still trying to process what I've found, and what it might mean." Professor Montgomery approached the table with the reverence of someone entering a sacred space. Her eyes widened as she surveyed the documents Sarah had laid out, and her hands, already gloved, hovered over them as if reluctant to make contact despite the protection. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to one of the letters. "Of course," Sarah nodded. The professor carefully lifted one of the documents, a letter dated 1787, with a signature that appeared to be from Benjamin Franklin. She examined it silently, her eyes moving methodically across the page, occasionally pausing to study particular elements more closely. "The paper appears period-appropriate," she murmured almost to herself. "The watermark is consistent with what would have been available. Ink composition seems correct at a glance." She looked up at Sarah with newfound intensity. "Where exactly did you find these?" Sarah described the hidden space beneath the cellar floor, the chest, and her process of discovery. As she spoke, the professor's expression grew increasingly focused, her eyes occasionally darting back to the documents as if drawn by magnetic force. "And you said there are journals as well, from someone named Thomas Fielding?" Sarah nodded and retrieved the leather-bound volume she had found most revealing. "This contains the most potentially controversial content. Personal observations about the Founding Fathers and suggestions that some of their motivations and agreements weren't exactly what we've been taught." Professor Montgomery accepted the journal with visible excitement tempered by scholarly caution. "Fielding. The name doesn't immediately ring a bell, but there were numerous secretaries, clerks, and assistants whose contributions have been largely forgotten." She carefully opened the journal to where Sarah had placed a bookmark at a particularly revealing passage. As the professor read, her expression transformed from academic interest to something approaching awe, then concern. She looked up at Sarah, her voice low and serious. "Ms. Mitchell, if these documents are authentic, and I must emphasize that, proper authentication will require extensive testing, you may have discovered something truly extraordinary. This perspective on the Constitutional Convention—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Let's just say it presents a significantly more complex picture than the standard historical narrative." "Then you think they could be genuine?" Sarah asked, feeling a strange mixture of excitement and apprehension. "The physical characteristics appear consistent with period documents," the professor replied cautiously. "The handwriting styles, paper, ink, all seem appropriate for the late 18th century at first glance. But proper authentication will require tests that can't be conducted here: paper composition analysis, ink dating, handwriting comparison with known samples, provenance research." She carefully returned the journal to the table. "May I ask what you intend to do with these materials?" It was the question Sarah had been asking herself since the discovery. "I honestly don't know," she admitted. "I understand they may be historically important, but I also have practical concerns. This house represents nearly everything I have financially, and I need to understand what rights I might have as the finder, what obligations might exist regarding preservation." Professor Montgomery nodded thoughtfully. "Those are valid concerns. The legal status of such finds can be complex, especially when they potentially have national historical significance." She hesitated before continuing. "There's also the matter of the content itself. If authentic, some of these documents present perspectives that challenge cherished national narratives. That has implications beyond academic interest." The seriousness in the professor's tone sent a chill through Sarah. What kind of implications? Historical revelations of this nature can become politically charged very quickly, Montgomery explained. Different institutions, scholars, and even political factions might have vested interests in how or whether such information becomes public. She gestured to the journal. "Particularly when they suggest that some of our founding fathers may have had economic self-interest alongside idealism as motivating factors." Sarah hadn't fully considered the political dimensions of her discovery. As a librarian, she valued historical truth and open access to information, but she was beginning to realize that history, especially founding national narratives, was never politically neutral territory. "What would you recommend as a next step?" Sarah asked. "With your permission, I'd like to take detailed photographs of several key documents for preliminary analysis," the professor suggested. "I have colleagues who specialize in document authentication who could provide initial assessments without requiring the originals. This would give us better information before making any decisions about more formal authentication processes." Sarah considered this carefully. "And this would remain confidential for now?" "Absolutely," Professor Montgomery assured her. "Academic ethics would require me to maintain your confidentiality until you decide otherwise. I wouldn't share anything beyond what's necessary for preliminary authentication with trusted colleagues." After some discussion of specific details, Sarah agreed to the professor's proposal. They spent the next 2 hours carefully photographing selected documents under optimal lighting conditions, with Professor Montgomery providing guidance on capturing the details that would be most useful for preliminary authentication. As they worked, the professor shared insights about the historical context of various documents, occasionally pausing to read passages that particularly interested her. Her excitement was evident despite her professional restraint, and she several times remarked on the extraordinary nature of finding such well-preserved materials from this period. The chest itself likely helped preserve them, she noted. The sealed space beneath the floor would have maintained relatively stable temperature and humidity, and minimal exposure to light. Still, the condition is remarkable for documents of this age. As they were finishing, Sarah heard the front door open, the girls returning from their activities. She quickly gathered the documents, returning them to the chest as Professor Montgomery packed up her camera equipment. "Mom, who's? Okar is outside," Emma called from the entryway. "Just a colleague from work," Sarah replied, emerging from the dining room. "Professor Montgomery, these are my daughters, Emma and Lily." The professor greeted the girls warmly but briefly, clearly understanding Sarah's desire to keep the meeting low-key. After a few minutes of polite conversation, she prepared to leave, promising to be in touch within a few days with preliminary assessments. At the door, she paused and spoke quietly to Sarah. "Whatever these turn out to be, and I must say, my initial impression is very positive regarding their potential authenticity. You've handled this discovery with admirable care and responsibility. Many people would have immediately posted images online or contacted the media." Sarah nodded. "I just want to understand what I found before making any decisions that can't be undone." "A wise approach," the professor agreed. "History has waited 2 centuries for these documents to emerge. It can wait a little longer while we proceed carefully." After Professor Montgomery departed, Sarah faced the inevitable questions from her daughters, particularly the naturally curious Lily. She decided to provide a simplified version of the truth. "I found some old documents in the cellar that might be historically interesting," she explained. "Professor Montgomery is helping me figure out if they're valuable or important." "Like valuable enough to pay for college?" Emma asked with sudden interest. Sarah smiled. "I honestly don't know. Yet we need to determine if they're authentic first." "Can we see them?" Lily asked. After a moment's hesitation, Sarah decided that involving her daughters to a limited extent made more sense than creating mystery that would only fuel their curiosity. "I'll show you a few of them after dinner, but they're very fragile, so we need to be extremely careful." That evening, Sarah selected several of the less controversial documents to share with the girls. They gathered around the dining table, where Sarah had laid out the materials on clean white paper. "These are over 200 years old," she explained, demonstrating how to handle the edges carefully. "They may have been in that chest since before this house was even built." Emma and Lily were suitably impressed, examining the yellowed paper and faded handwriting with unexpected reverence. Emma, always practical, asked questions about authentication and potential value, while Lily was more interested in the personal aspects. Who might have written them, why they were hidden, and what secrets they might contain. "That's actually a very good question," Sarah told Lily. "Why were these documents hidden away so carefully? That's one of the things Professor Montgomery is going to help me try to figure out." Later, after the girls had gone to their rooms for the evening, Sarah returned to the chest and continued her examination of the contents. Beyond the more obviously significant political documents, there were personal letters that provided glimpses into daily life during the revolutionary period. These touched her in a different way. Parents writing of concerns for children, discussions of illness and recovery, celebrations of births and mourning of deaths. These human elements connected her across centuries to the people whose words she was reading. One letter particularly affected her, a mother writing to her sister about the challenges of raising children alone while her husband was away fighting. The woman's determination to maintain stability for her children despite financial hardship and uncertainty resonated deeply with Sarah's own experience as a single mother. Though separated by more than 2 centuries, their fundamental concerns were remarkably similar. As she carefully replaced the documents in the chest, Sarah reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought these historical materials into her life. The very financial hardship that had led her to purchase this old house in foreclosure had now potentially connected her to a significant historical discovery. The time she had spent learning renovation skills out of necessity had led directly to finding the hidden compartment that previous owners had overlooked or ignored. She placed the chest securely in her closet and prepared for bed, her mind still buzzing with questions about what she had found and what it might mean, not just for history, but for her family's future. Whatever these documents revealed about America's founding principles, they had already revealed something to Sarah about her own life, that hardship and opportunity were often intertwined in unexpected ways, and that history, both personal and national, was rarely as simple as the stories we tell about it. As she drifted towards sleep, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her discovery was about to set in motion events beyond her control. The carefully preserved words of Thomas Fielding and his contemporaries, hidden for over 2 centuries, seemed almost to have been waiting for the right moment to emerge. Whether the world was ready for their revelations remained to be seen. 3 days after Sarah Mitchell discovered the hidden chest, her phone chimed with an incoming email notification. Professor Montgomery's name appeared on the screen, sending a rush of anticipation through her as she opened the message. "Sarah, I need to speak with you urgently. The preliminary assessments from my colleagues are complete and the results are significant. Please call me as soon as possible, regardless of the hour." The formal tone and uncharacteristic urgency from the typically measured academic sent a wave of anxiety through Sarah. She glanced at the clock. 9:37 p.m. The girls were in their rooms, Emma studying for a calculus test, Lily likely sketching while listening to music. Sarah stepped onto the back porch for privacy and dialed the professor's number. "Thank you for calling so promptly," Professor Montgomery answered, her voice tense. "Are you somewhere we can speak freely?" "Yes," Sarah replied, the knot in her stomach tightening. "What have you found?" "The initial authentication assessments are extraordinarily positive," Montgomery began. "The paper composition, ink characteristics, and handwriting analyses all strongly support authenticity. The watermarks match known paper sources from the period, and several signatures correspond to verified examples from archives." "That's good news, isn't it?" Sarah asked, confused by the professor's evident concern. "It's remarkable news from a historical perspective," Montgomery clarified, "but it creates complications. The content of Fielding's journal and several of the letters contain information that, if verified and made public, would significantly challenge established historical narratives about the founding of our nation." A moment of silence hung between them before the professor continued. "Sarah, one of my colleagues I consulted, Dr. Harrison from the National Archives, has expressed strong interest in examining the original documents immediately. He's specifically interested in what he's calling the supplementary agreements, mentioned in several letters." "You shared the content with someone from the National Archives?" Sarah asked, a note of alarm in her voice. "Only selected images for authentication purposes, with identifying information redacted," Montgomery assured her. "But Harrison is remarkably well versed in this period. He recognized references to certain meetings and agreements that align with gaps in the official record. He believes your documents may contain evidence of privately negotiated economic arrangements between founding figures and certain European banking interests, arrangements deliberately kept out of official records." The implications began to dawn on Sarah. "And this would change our understanding of the motivations behind certain founding decisions." "Potentially, fundamentally," Montgomery confirmed. "The traditional narrative portrays the founding primarily as an ideological revolution driven by Enlightenment principles. These documents suggest a more complex reality, where personal financial interests played a significant role in shaping key decisions, particularly regarding our banking system and certain state-to-state relationships." Sarah sank onto the porch swing, watching her breath form small clouds in the autumn evening air. What does Dr. Harrison want? He's requested to examine the originals. He's prepared to come to Massachusetts personally as early as tomorrow. The speed of developments alarmed Sarah. Just days ago, the documents had been safely hidden for centuries. Now, a government official was prepared to travel across the country to see them immediately. "I need time to think," Sarah said firmly. "This is all moving very quickly." "I understand completely," Montgomery replied. "But I should mention that Harrison was quite emphatic about the historical significance. He mentioned protocols regarding materials of exceptional national interest, though he wasn't specific about what that might mean, practically. The professor's careful phrasing sent a warning signal. Are you suggesting the government might make a claim on these documents? I'm not certain, Montgomery admitted. The legal status of historical finds is complex. I would recommend consulting with an attorney who specializes in cultural artifacts and historical preservation before proceeding further. After ending the call, Sarah remained on the porch, her mind racing. The chest and its contents had become more than just an interesting historical discovery. They were potentially explosive documents that powerful institutions might have vested interests in controlling. Inside, she found Emma at the kitchen table, textbooks spread around her laptop. "Everything okay, Mom? You look worried," Emma observed, glancing up from her notes. "Just some unexpected developments with those old documents," Sarah replied, trying to keep her tone casual. "The expert thinks they might be more important than we initially thought." Emma's eyes lit up. "Important enough to help with college tuition?" Sarah managed to smile. "Maybe, but it's complicated." She hesitated, then made a decision. "Actually, I could use your research skills. Do you think you could help me find information on legal rights regarding historical artifacts found on private property? And maybe laws about historically significant documents?" Emma straightened, clearly pleased to be asked for help. "Sure, I can take a break from derivatives for this. It's way more interesting." Together, they spent the next 2 hours researching relevant laws and precedents. The picture that emerged was murky at best. While homeowners generally had rights to items found on their property, various federal and state laws created exceptions for artifacts of particular historical significance. Native American remains and artifacts were clearly protected by specific legislation, but other historical items fell into grayer areas. "It looks like a lot depends on how the courts interpret national historical significance," Emma observed, scrolling through a legal database she'd accessed through her school's research portal. "There's something called the Cultural Properties Act that might apply, but there are also private property protections in Massachusetts law that could work in your favor." Sarah nodded, impressed by her daughter's analytical skills. "What about the National Archives? Do they have special authority to claim historical documents?" Emma typed rapidly, then frowned. "It's not clear-cut. They're responsible for preserving important records, but their authority to claim private documents seems to vary based on the specific circumstances and historical significance." By midnight, Sarah had reached several conclusions. First, she needed proper legal advice before proceeding further. Second, she needed better security for the documents until their status was resolved. And third, she needed to understand more about what exactly she had found before others, with institutional authority, took control of the narrative. The next morning, after the girls left for school, Sarah called in sick to work again and set about addressing these concerns. She contacted several law firms that specialized in cultural heritage and property rights, eventually securing a consultation with attorney Michael Rossi for later that afternoon. Next, she purchased a fireproof, waterproof safe from a local home improvement store, not ideal for long-term document preservation, but better than her bedroom closet for immediate security. Finally, she returned to the documents themselves, focusing specifically on the references to supplementary agreements that had so interested Dr. Harrison. Several letters between Thomas Fielding and various correspondents mentioned these agreements, often in cryptic terms. One passage particularly stood out: the arrangement with the Amsterdam Consortium remains protected by the supplementary articles, which BF assures will never appear in any public record. The participating delegates have secured their interests admirably, though I question whether posterity will judge such measures as consistent with the publicly espoused principles of our new government. The necessity of attracting certain European financial support for our fledgling nation perhaps justifies these private accommodations, yet I cannot help but wonder if we have merely exchanged one master for another, less visible but equally demanding. Sarah couldn't fully decipher the specific financial arrangements being referenced, but the implication was clear. Some of the founding fathers had made private economic deals with European financial interests that they deliberately kept separate from official records, deals that might have influenced the structure of the new government in ways not publicly acknowledged. At 2 o'clock, Sarah carefully secured the documents in the new safe, hidden in her bedroom closet, and drove to Attorney Rossi's office in downtown Burnfield. The law office occupied the second floor of a colonial-era building on Main Street, its interior a blend of historical charm and modern efficiency. Michael Rossi proved to be younger than Sarah had expected, perhaps in his early 40s, with an energetic manner that contrasted with the stereotypical staid attorney. His specialty in cultural heritage law had developed from a dual background in law and historical preservation, giving him particular insight into Sarah's situation. After Sarah explained her discovery and the recent developments, including Professor Montgomery's call about Dr. Harrison's interest, Rossi leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers thoughtfully on his desk. "You've found yourself in a fascinating legal grey area, Miss Mitchell," he observed. "Based on your description, these documents potentially have immense historical significance, which activates certain legal considerations. However, as the homeowner who discovered them on your property, you have substantial rights that can't simply be dismissed." "What's your recommendation?" Sarah asked. "First, don't allow anyone to remove the original documents from your possession until we've established a clear legal framework," Rossi advised. "You can continue to cooperate with authentication efforts, but any examination should occur either in your presence or under strictly controlled conditions with clear documentation of chain of custody." He pulled a legal pad toward him and began, making notes. "Second, we should file a preliminary notice of discovery with the State Historical Commission. This establishes your role as the finder and your cooperation with proper procedures, which strengthens your position if questions of ownership arise later." "And what about the National Archives representative who wants to examine them immediately?" Rossi's expression grew more serious. "That's where things get complicated. The National Archives has significant authority regarding documents of national importance, but that authority isn't unlimited, particularly with privately discovered materials. I'd recommend allowing examination under controlled conditions, perhaps at Burnfield College with Professor Montgomery present, but with a clear written agreement that this examination doesn't constitute any transfer of ownership or control." Sarah nodded, feeling more grounded with this concrete advice. "And if they try to claim the documents based on national significance?" "Then we're prepared to assert your rights through appropriate legal channels," Rossi stated firmly. "The fact that these documents have been privately held for over 2 centuries, not stolen from any government repository, strengthens your position considerably. At minimum, you would be entitled to fair compensation and recognition as the discoverer, even in a worst-case legal scenario." As they discussed next steps, Rossi drafted a preliminary agreement that Sarah could use for Dr. Harrison's examination of the documents. It specified that any examination was for authentication and historical assessment only, with no implied transfer of ownership or control. One more thing to consider, Rossi added as their meeting concluded. The historical significance of these documents may extend beyond legal and financial considerations. If they indeed contain perspectives that challenge conventional historical narratives about our nation's founding, various interests might prefer they remain obscure or have their authenticity questioned. History is never politically neutral, especially founding mythology. Sarah nodded, recalling Professor Montgomery's similar warning. I'm beginning to understand that. It's a bit overwhelming to think that clearing out my cellar might end up challenging how American history is taught. That's precisely why proceeding carefully is so important, Rossi emphasized, not just for legal protection, but to ensure that whatever historical truths these documents contain are properly contextualized and preserved, regardless of how challenging they might be to established narratives. As Sarah drove home, her mind spun with the escalating implications of her discovery. What had begun as an interesting historical find was rapidly evolving into something with potential national significance. Documents that might reveal that America's founding involved complex financial arrangements deliberately kept out of official records. She arrived home to find Professor Montgomery's car already parked in her driveway. The professor was waiting on the front porch, accompanied by a tall, distinguished-looking man in a precisely tailored grey suit, who Sarah immediately guessed was Dr. Harrison from the National Archives. "I apologize for arriving unannounced," Montgomery said as Sarah approached. "Dr. Harrison was already en route when we spoke last night. He was quite insistent on proceeding without delay." The man stepped forward, extending his hand. "Dr. James Harrison, Special Collections Division, National Archives. Professor Montgomery's preliminary images have created quite a stir in certain circles, Ms. Mitchell. I'm here to offer the archive's assistance in authentication and preservation of what may be documents of exceptional national significance." His tone was professionally cordial, but Sarah detected an underlying intensity that confirmed her growing concerns. This wasn't merely academic interest. The government had mobilized with remarkable speed to assess her discovery. "I appreciate your interest, Dr. Harrison," Sarah replied carefully. "However, I've just come from meeting with my attorney, who has advised me on appropriate procedures for handling historically significant finds. I'd be happy to arrange a proper examination of the documents, but it will need to occur under specific conditions with appropriate agreements in place." A flicker of surprise crossed Harrison's face, quickly replaced by a measured smile. "Of course, we certainly respect private property rights, Ms. Mitchell. I'm simply offering the archives considerable resources to assist with proper authentication and preservation. These documents, if genuine, represent an exceptional historical discovery that deserves the highest standard of care." "Why don't we discuss this inside?" Sarah suggested, unlocking her front door. "The girls won't be home for several hours, so we can speak freely." In the living room, Sarah outlined the conditions her attorney had recommended. Examination at Burnfield College with Professor Montgomery present, no removal of documents without explicit written permission, and a signed agreement acknowledging Sarah's ownership rights pending any formal legal determination. Harrison listened with well-practiced patience, but his displeasure was evident in the tightening around his eyes. "These seem like unnecessarily formal precautions, Ms. Mitchell. The National Archives routinely handles historically significant materials with the utmost care and professional standards." "I don't doubt that," Sarah replied evenly. "But as my attorney emphasized, The legal status of historical finds is complex. I'm simply ensuring proper procedures are followed from the outset. After some negotiation, they reached a compromise. Dr. Harrison would examine selected documents the following day at Burnfield College, with both Professor Montgomery and Sarah present. He would sign the agreement Sarah's attorney had prepared, acknowledging that the examination didn't constitute any transfer of ownership or control. "There is one other matter," Harrison said as they concluded arrangements. "Given the potential national significance of these materials, security is a legitimate concern. Have you considered the safety risks of keeping such potentially valuable documents in a private residence?" The implied suggestion that her home wasn't secure enough sent a wave of defensiveness through Sarah. "I've taken appropriate security measures," she stated firmly, not elaborating on the new safe or other precautions. Harrison nodded, though his expression suggested skepticism. "The archives could offer secure temporary storage while authentication proceeds, relieving you of that burden and risk." "Thank you, but that won't be necessary at this stage," Sarah replied, recognizing the offer as an attempt to establish government custody of the documents. After Harrison departed to check into his hotel, Professor Montgomery remained behind, her expression troubled. "I feel I should apologize," she said once they were alone. "When I consulted colleagues for authentication, I had no idea it would escalate so quickly to this level of government interest." Sarah shook her head. "You couldn't have known. But I am curious, what exactly in these documents has created such immediate and high-level interest? Harrison flew across the country overnight based on a few images." Montgomery hesitated. "It's the references to the supplementary agreements with European financial interests. Those align with certain historical gaps that scholars have noted but never been able to document. If these materials provide evidence that founding figures established undisclosed financial arrangements with European banking interests that influenced our governmental and financial structures." She trailed off, the implications hanging in the air. "That would contradict the standard narrative of the American Revolution as primarily ideological," Sarah finished. "Precisely. It would suggest that while liberty and democracy were genuine motivations, specific economic interests of key founders also played a significant role in shaping our institutions, a far more complex and perhaps less inspiring origin story than the one we teach schoolchildren." After the professor left, Sarah spent the evening carefully selecting which documents to present for Harrison's examination the following day. She deliberately excluded some of the most politically sensitive materials, particularly those that most explicitly discussed the private financial motivations of specific founding fathers. This wasn't about hiding information, she reasoned, but about maintaining some control over the process until she better understood the implications. The next morning, Sarah arranged for the girls to stay with a friend after school, explaining that she had an important meeting at the college. She carefully packed the selected documents in acid-free folders borrowed from the library, placing them in a secure document case for transport. At Burnfield College, Professor Montgomery had arranged for them to use a climate-controlled room in the Special Collections Department of the library. Dr. Harrison was already waiting when Sarah arrived, accompanied by a younger colleague he introduced as Ms. Peters, a document conservation specialist. "Before we begin," Sarah said, placing the document case on the table but not yet opening it, "I'll need both of you to sign the agreement my attorney prepared." Harrison's mouth tightened slightly, but he signed without comment, as did Ms. Peters. Sarah then carefully opened the case and began removing the folders containing the selected documents. Over the next 3 hours, Harrison and Peters examined the materials with meticulous attention, using specialized equipment they had, brought to assess paper composition, ink characteristics, and other physical properties. They photographed each document from multiple angles under various light conditions, occasionally conferring in hushed tones. Sarah observed the process carefully, noting which documents seemed to generate the most interest. Harrison repeatedly returned to one letter in particular, correspondence between Thomas Fielding and a Mr. A. Hamilton, discussing the establishment of the First Bank of the United States and certain private assurances given to unnamed European investors. The physical characteristics are consistent with authentic period documents, Harrison finally stated, setting aside his magnifying glass. The watermarks, paper composition, ink formulation, all align with known examples from this period. Miss Peters will need to conduct more detailed analysis of the images we've taken, but my preliminary assessment strongly supports authenticity. And the content, Professor Montgomery asked. What is your historical assessment? Harrison exchanged a glance with Peters before responding carefully. If authentic, and I must emphasize we're still in preliminary assessment, these materials would represent a significant historical find. They appear to document perspectives and possibly arrangements not reflected in the official record of this period. His measured understatement didn't fool Sarah. The intensity with which he had examined certain documents made clear their potential impact. What happens next in your process? Sarah asked. Ideally, we would conduct more comprehensive authentication at our facilities in Washington, Harrison replied. The archives has specialized equipment and reference materials that would allow definitive authentication. We could arrange secure transport and provide you with regular updates on the process. The suggestion that the documents leave her possession wasn't unexpected, but Sarah was prepared. That won't be possible at this stage. My attorney has advised that the documents should remain in my custody while we determine next steps. Harrison's professional demeanor slipped momentarily, revealing frustration. Ms. Mitchell, these documents, if authentic, have exceptional national significance. The National Archives has both the responsibility and the resources to ensure their proper preservation and study. I understand that, Sarah replied steadily, but they were discovered on my property, and legal questions of ownership need to be resolved before they leave my possession. I'm committed to ensuring proper preservation and historical documentation, but through a process that respects my legal position as the finder. The tension in the room was palpable as Harrison considered his response. Finally, he nodded stiffly. I respect your position, though I believe it unnecessarily complicates the process. At minimum, would you permit us to share our preliminary findings with colleagues at the archives for consultation? This would not require physically transferring the documents. This seemed a reasonable compromise, and Sarah agreed, with the condition that any shared images would have ownership attribution to her as the discoverer. As they were packing up, Harrison made one final attempt. Ms. Mitchell, I hope you understand the responsibility that comes with possessing materials of this historical significance. Proper preservation requires specialized conditions that most private homes simply cannot provide. I'm aware of the preservation requirements, Sarah responded, secure in the knowledge that the library where she worked had similar archival materials. And I'm taking appropriate measures to ensure these documents remain in the same excellent condition they've maintained for over 2 centuries. After Harrison and Peters departed, Professor Montgomery lingered, helping Sarah carefully repack the documents. He'll be making calls to Washington as soon as he reaches his hotel, Montgomery observed. Your discovery has clearly triggered significant interest at high levels. Do you think they'll try to claim the documents through legal channels? Sarah asked. It's possible, Montgomery admitted, though your attorney's approach of establishing clear ownership rights from the outset was excellent strategy. The fact that you're proceeding responsibly regarding preservation and authentication strengthens your position considerably. Sarah secured the document case and prepared to leave. What I still don't fully understand is why there's such intensity around these specific documents. There must be countless historical materials discovered every year. Not like these, Montgomery replied seriously. Most historical discoveries align with or slightly expand existing narratives. What makes your documents potentially explosive is that they suggest our founding narrative itself, the story America tells about its origins, may be significantly incomplete or even deliberately sanitized. As Sarah drove home, the weight of this observation settled over her. She had stumbled upon materials that didn't just add detail to history, but potentially challenged fundamental national mythology. No wonder the response had been so swift and at such high levels. Arriving home, Sarah was surprised to find a dark SUV parked across the street from her house. As she pulled into her driveway, she noticed a man sitting in the driver's seat, apparently watching her house. When he saw her looking, he started the vehicle and drove away. A chill ran through her that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Was she now under surveillance? The thought seemed paranoid, yet Harrison's intense interest and the speed of government response suggested these documents might have implications beyond what she had initially imagined. Inside, Sarah secured the documents in her safe, then checked the house carefully, suddenly aware of its vulnerability. The colonial era. Locks and windows had always been part of its charm. Now they seemed woefully inadequate as security measures. As she was considering what additional precautions she might take, her phone rang, Attorney Rossi calling for an update on the meeting with Harrison. "He's convinced they're authentic," Sarah reported, describing the examination process and Harrison's attempts to have the documents transferred to Washington. "You did exactly right," Rossi assured her. "Maintaining physical possession at this stage is crucial to preserving your legal position." Did Harrison give any indication of next steps from their side? "Nothing specific, but he wasn't happy about leaving without the documents," Sarah replied, then hesitated before adding, "And I think someone may have been watching my house." "Describe exactly what you saw," Rossi requested, his tone sharpening. After Sarah related the incident with the SUV, Rossi was quiet for a moment. "It could be nothing, but given the circumstances, we should take it seriously. The historical significance of these documents appears to be triggering an unusual level of interest." "What should I do?" Sarah asked, glancing nervously toward her front windows. "For now, basic security precautions. Make sure all doors and windows are secured. Consider staying with a friend for a night or two if you feel unsafe. I'll make some calls to colleagues who specialize in cultural property security for more specific recommendations." After ending the call, Sarah checked all the doors and windows, then sat at her kitchen table, trying to process the rapidly escalating situation. What had begun as an interesting historical discovery during a home renovation project had suddenly thrust her into a complex web of historical significance, government interest, and potential security concerns. As she pondered her next steps, Sarah's phone chimed with a text message from Emma. "Coming home early, Lily not feeling well, Mrs. Parker dropping us off in 10 minutes. The reminder of her daughter's imminent arrival grounded Sarah immediately. Whatever historical significance these documents held, her primary responsibility remained to Emma and Lily. She needed to handle this situation in a way that protected them from unnecessary stress, while also securing what might prove to be historically transformative materials. When the girls arrived, Lily indeed looked pale, complaining of a headache and upset stomach. Sarah settled her on the living room couch with a blanket and ginger ale, momentarily setting aside her concerns about historical documents and government interest to focus on basic maternal care. As she took Lily's temperature, Sarah was struck by the strange juxtaposition, the mundane reality of caring for a sick teenager alongside the extraordinary circumstances of possessing documents that might reshape understanding of American history. Both were equally real, equally demanding of her attention and care. In that moment, Sarah realized that whatever path she chose regarding the documents needed to prioritize her family's well-being, the historical truth contained in Thomas Fielding's writings had waited over 2 centuries to emerge. It could wait a little longer while she ensured her daughter's security and peace of mind. Yet even as she focused on Lily's immediate needs, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that events had been set in motion that would prove difficult to control. The appearance of the SUV, Harrison's barely concealed determination to acquire the documents, the potentially explosive nature of their contents, all suggested that the comfortable anonymity of her life as a small-town librarian and single mother had been irrevocably altered by what she had found beneath her cellar floor. A week after Dr. Harrison's examination of the documents, Sarah's life had taken on a surreal quality. Outwardly, she maintained her normal routine, working at the library, helping the girls with homework, addressing the endless maintenance needs of her old colonial home. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, everything had changed. The dark SUV had reappeared several times, always parked just far enough away to maintain plausible deniability about surveillance. Sarah's email had been flooded with increasingly urgent messages from Dr. Harrison, requesting additional access to the documents and proposing various arrangements for their temporary transfer to National Archives facilities. Meanwhile, Professor Montgomery had connected Sarah with several prominent historians who expressed great interest in examining the materials, particularly Fielding's journal with its unfiltered perspective on the Founding Fathers' private motivations. Attorney Rossi had been invaluable, helping Sarah navigate these competing interests while maintaining control of the situation. On his recommendation, she had installed new security measures, better locks, motion-sensing lights, and a basic alarm system that seemed oddly modern against the colonial architecture of her home. As Sarah shelved books in the library's history section, her mind kept returning to the documents secured in her home safe. The journal entries and letters had begun to take on almost mythic significance in her thoughts. Words written by an obscure clerk over 2 centuries ago that potentially challenged foundational narratives about America's origins. "You seem a million miles away today," observed Eleanor Davis, the head librarian and Sarah's supervisor for the past 7 years. "Everything all right at home? The girls doing okay?" Sarah managed a smile. "Just a lot on my mind. House issues, you know how it is with these old places." Eleanor nodded sympathetically. "Those colonial homes are beautiful but demanding, like having another child that never grows up and constantly needs attention." If only it were just maintenance issues, Sarah thought. She had told no one at work about her discovery, following Rossi's advice to limit knowledge of the documents to the smallest possible circle until their status was resolved. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a text from Emma. "Mom, there's a woman at the house asking about you. Says she's a historian from Boston University. Should I talk to her?" Sarah's heart raced. She hadn't arranged any meetings today, and the girls had been instructed not to engage with unexpected visitors. "No, don't open the door. Tell her I'm at work and she needs to email me for an appointment. Text me when she leaves." She immediately called Rossi, stepping into the library's break room for privacy. "This is concerning but not entirely unexpected," he said, after Sarah explained the situation. "Word is spreading in academic circles about potentially significant historical documents. I've received 3 calls myself from researchers inquiring about the Burnfield discovery, though I've revealed nothing about the specifics." "What should I do?" Sarah asked, watching the clock anxiously. Her shift wouldn't end for another 3 hours. "I'll send my associate to your house to check on the girls and make sure this visitor has left," Rossi offered. "In the meantime, I think we need to accelerate our timeline for securing the documents. The increased attention raises the risk of theft or unauthorized access." By the time Sarah arrived home, Emma reported that the mystery visitor had left. After being told Sarah wasn't available, but had seemed unusually persistent, asking questions about the house's history and renovation projects. Rossi's associate, a young attorney named Diane Walker, had arrived shortly after and stayed until Sarah returned. "The security situation is becoming more complex," Diane advised as they spoke privately in the kitchen. "Mr. Rossi believes we should transfer the documents to a secure facility temporarily while we finalize legal arrangements regarding their status." "What kind of facility?" Sarah asked cautiously. "Burnfield Trust Bank has a private vault service used by several museums for temporary storage. Mr. Rossi has arranged for access if you agree. The documents would remain legally in your possession, but would have professional-grade security." The suggestion made practical sense, yet Sarah felt a strange reluctance to let the documents leave her home. They had been hidden beneath her cellar floor for over 2 centuries. Moving them felt somehow like breaking a trust. "I need to think about it," she said finally. After Diane left, Sarah checked on the girls. Lily was in the living room working on an art project for school, a diorama depicting a Revolutionary War scene, ironically enough. Emma was upstairs, ostensibly studying, though Sarah suspected she was researching colleges again, a process that had become almost obsessive as senior year progressed. In her bedroom, Sarah carefully removed the chest from the safe and examined the documents again. She had spent hours with them over the past week, gradually piecing together the narrative they contained. Thomas Fielding had indeed been a clerk, initially working for several delegates to the Continental Congress and later serving in various administrative capacities during the early formation of the government. His position had given him remarkable access to private conversations and unofficial agreements, which he had meticulously documented in his journal and correspondence. The picture that emerged was far more complex than the standard historical narrative of the American founding. According to Fielding's records, while the ideals of liberty and self-governance were genuine motivations, specific economic arrangements had played a crucial role in shaping key structures of the new government. Certain founding fathers had negotiated private financial agreements with European banking interests, particularly Dutch and Swiss financiers, that influenced the design of America's financial system and certain aspects of interstate commerce regulations. Most strikingly, Fielding documented private meetings where these arrangements were discussed explicitly as motivations for specific provisions in the Constitution, provisions that publicly were justified on purely philosophical or political grounds. As she carefully returned the documents to their acid-free folders, Sarah's phone rang, Professor Montgomery calling with news. "Sarah, something significant has developed," the professor began without preamble. "Dr. Harrison has filed an official inquiry with the Massachusetts Historical Commission regarding the documents. He's citing provisions of the National Historic Preservation Act that could potentially be used to assert federal interest in materials of exceptional historical significance." "What does that mean practically?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "It's the first step in potentially establishing a legal claim," Montgomery confirmed. "He's building a case that these documents are so fundamentally important to national history that they should be preserved in the National Archives rather than remaining in private hands. Can he do that?" "It's complex legal territory," Montgomery admitted. "The law generally respects private property rights, including historical fines on private property. But there are provisions for items of extraordinary national significance, particularly when proper preservation might be at issue. The documents have survived for over 2 centuries in that chest, Sarah pointed out, frustration edging into her voice. They don't suddenly need government intervention to continue existing. I understand your frustration, Montgomery said gently. But from a historical preservation perspective, these documents, if they are what we believe them to be, represent an extraordinary national treasure. The debate over their proper home is almost inevitable given their significance. After the call ended, Sarah sat on her bed, the weight of responsibility settling over her more heavily than ever. The documents in her possession potentially changed understanding of America's founding in fundamental ways. The question of who should control access to them and how their revelation should be presented to the public had implications far beyond her personal interests. Her reflection was interrupted by a knock on her bedroom door. "Mom," Emma called, "there's something weird happening outside." Sarah opened the door to find both girls looking concerned. Following them to Emma's bedroom window, which faced the street, Sarah's breath caught at the sight of 3 vehicles now parked across from their house. The dark SUV that had been appearing regularly, now joined by a sedan and what appeared to be a news van with satellite equipment on its roof. "What's going on?" Lily asked, her voice small. "Why are people watching our house?" Sarah pulled the curtains closed and turned to her daughters, realizing she could no longer shield them from the situation. They deserved to understand why their home had suddenly become the focus of such attention. "Let's go downstairs," she said. "I need to explain something important." In the kitchen, Sarah made hot chocolate, a family tradition for serious conversations, since the girls were small, and explained the full significance of what she had discovered in the cellar. She described the documents, their apparent authenticity, and why various people were suddenly so interested in their house. "So these papers basically say the Founding Fathers had secret financial deals that they kept out of the history books," Emma summarized, her analytical mind immediately grasping the implications. "That's part of it," Sarah confirmed. "They suggest that while liberty and democracy were genuine goals, specific economic arrangements with European banking interests played a significant role in shaping our government, arrangements that were deliberately kept out of official records." "And now the government wants to take them away?" Lily asked. "They're making an argument that documents this historically significant should be in the National Archives," Sarah explained carefully. "And there's some merit to that position from a preservation and accessibility standpoint. But there are also complicated questions about who controls the narrative these documents present." Emma, ever practical, cut to the heart of the matter. "Could this help pay for college? I mean, if they're that important, they must be worth something." Sarah smiled despite the tension. "That's actually a complex legal question we're still working through. But yes, as the discoverer, I likely have certain rights that could potentially include financial compensation if the documents end up in a museum or archive." "Cool," Emma replied. "So we found buried treasure after all." "It's more important than treasure," Lily interjected, surprising both Sarah and Emma with her passion. "It's the truth about how America really started. That matters more than money." Sarah regarded her younger daughter with newfound appreciation, despite her struggles. With history class, Lily instinctively grasped the moral significance of historical truth. "You're right," Sarah acknowledged, "which is why we need to be careful about how we proceed. These documents could change how people understand American history, for better or worse." As the girls processed this information, Sarah's phone rang. Again, Attorney Rossi calling with urgent news. "Sarah, we have a situation developing," he began. "A reporter from the Boston Herald has somehow gotten wind of the discovery." They're running a story tomorrow with the headline, "Revolutionary Documents Found in Burnfield Home Could Rewrite History." They've requested an interview with you. How did they find out? Sarah asked, watching her daughter's eyes widen at this development. Unclear, but my guess is academic circles. These kinds of discoveries generate talk, and journalists have sources in universities. Rossi paused. With this going public, we need to move quickly to secure both the documents and your legal position. Are you willing to transfer them to the secure facility tonight? Sarah looked at her daughters, who were watching her intently, then made her decision. Yes, and I want to bring the girls with me. I don't feel comfortable leaving them here with all this attention. Within an hour, Rossi had arranged everything. His associate Diane would meet them at Burnfield Trust Bank, where a private vault had been prepared. Sarah carefully packed the documents in archival quality materials, then placed the entire collection in a specialized transport case Rossi had delivered, a hardened container designed specifically for moving valuable artifacts. As they prepared to leave through the back door, to avoid the vehicles parked out front, Emma handed Sarah a USB drive. "What's this?" Sarah asked. "Insurance," Emma replied with a determined expression. "I've been photographing all the documents over the past week while you were at work. High-resolution images of everything, properly labeled and backed up to cloud storage with encryption, just in case someone tries to take the originals before we figure out our rights." Sarah stared at her daughter in astonishment. "You did this without telling me?" Emma shrugged. "I figured it couldn't hurt to have digital copies only we control. The historical truth should be up to us to share, not just government officials." The initiative and foresight displayed by her 17-year-old both impressed and slightly alarmed Sarah. "We need to be careful about copyright and ownership issues, but this was smart thinking, Emma. Thank you." They slipped out through the backyard, cutting through a neighbor's property to reach the street behind their house, where Rossi waited in his car. The drive to Burnfield Trust Bank took only 10 minutes, but felt much longer as Sarah constantly checked the rearview mirror for signs of being followed. The bank's after-hours entrance led to a discreet reception area where Diane Walker waited with the bank's security manager. They were escorted to a lower level where climate-controlled, secure vaults were maintained for private clients and institutional users. "The vault maintains museum-quality environmental conditions," the security manager explained as he unlocked a series of progressively more secure doors. "Temperature and humidity are controlled precisely, with redundant systems to prevent fluctuations that could damage sensitive materials." The storage room itself was smaller than Sarah had expected, perhaps 10 feet square, but with an impressive array of security features, including biometric access controls and 24-hour video monitoring. A central table provided space to examine the contents of the transport case one final time before secure storage. As Sarah carefully laid out selected documents for a brief condition check, she was struck by the contrast between the ultra-modern security facility and the centuries-old papers before her. Thomas Fielding's elegant handwriting, describing private meetings of founding fathers, now rested under state-of-the-art LED conservation lighting, his observations about secret financial arrangements protected by biometric locks and digital surveillance. "Once we complete the inventory, only you will have access authorization," the security manager informed Sarah. "Not even bank personnel can enter without your approval or a court order." The documentation process took nearly an hour, with each item carefully catalogued and photographed as part of the chain of custody record. Throughout the process, Emma and Lily observed with solemn interest, seeming to grasp the historical significance of the moment. Their family temporarily transferring custody of documents that might reshape understanding of American history to a secure facility worthy of national treasures. After completing the necessary paperwork, Sarah authorized access for Attorney Rossi and Professor Montgomery in case of emergency, then reluctantly left the documents secured in their new home. Despite the rational understanding that they were far safer here than in her bedroom closet, Sarah felt a strange emptiness as they departed, as if she had given up something more significant than physical custody of historical papers. You okay, Mom?" Lily asked as they drove back to their house. "Just processing everything," Sarah replied honestly. "It's been an overwhelming few weeks." "I think you're being really brave," Lily offered unexpectedly, "standing up to government people and making sure history gets told right. It's like you're protecting the truth." The simple observation from her younger daughter touched Sarah deeply. She hadn't thought of her actions in those terms. She'd been focused on practical concerns like legal rights and security, but Lily had cut through to a more fundamental principle at stake. As they approached their street, Sarah was alarmed to see that the number of vehicles had increased, now including 2 news vans and several cars parked along both sides of the road. Lights blazed from multiple camera setups, and she could see reporters standing at the ready, presumably waiting for her return. "We can't go home, can we?" Emma observed grimly. "Not tonight," Sarah agreed, driving past without slowing down. "Let's find a hotel for now." They checked into a modest hotel on the outskirts of town, using cash to avoid creating an electronic trail. The girls adapted to the situation with remarkable resilience, treating it as an unexpected adventure rather than a disruption. They ordered pizza delivery and watched movies on the hotel television, creating a sense of normalcy in highly abnormal circumstances. After the girls fell asleep, Sarah sat by the window, scrolling through dozens of missed calls and messages on her phone. Beyond the expected communications from Rossi, Montgomery, and Harrison were numerous requests from journalists, historians, and even several documentary filmmakers, all seeking information about the Burnfield discovery, as it was now being called. A text from Professor Montgomery included a link to an online article already published by the Boston Herald. "Revolutionary discovery, documents found in Massachusetts' home, may reveal Founding Fathers' secret financial deals." The article was surprisingly detailed, mentioning Thomas Fielding by name and specifically referencing undisclosed agreements with European banking interests that shaped the new nation's financial system. It quoted an unnamed source from the National Archives confirming that preliminary authentication suggested the documents were genuine and of extraordinary historical significance. Most concerning to Sarah was the article's specific mention of her name and profession, along with a photograph of her house. While it didn't disclose the exact address, anyone familiar with Burnfield could easily identify the location. Her privacy had been thoroughly compromised. Sarah called Rossi despite the late hour, relieved when he answered immediately. "I've seen the article," he said before she could even explain. "We're preparing a formal cease and desist regarding your personal information, though the damage is largely done. More importantly, I've been in contact with the Massachusetts Historical Commission and the State Attorney General's office regarding the legal status of the documents." "What are they saying?" Sarah asked. "It's complicated," Rossi admitted. "The historical significance is creating pressure to formalize the document's status quickly. Dr. Harrison has filed an emergency petition requesting temporary custody transfer to the National Archives pending final determination of ownership and public access rights." "Can he do that?" "He can try," Rossi replied, "but we've countered with our own filing asserting your rights as the discoverer and emphasizing that the documents are already secured in appropriate preservation conditions. The judge assigned to the case has scheduled an emergency hearing for tomorrow morning." "That's incredibly fast," Sarah observed, alarm growing. "The public interest is accelerating everything," Rossi explained. Once the media got involved, this transformed from a private legal matter to a public controversy about national heritage. The good news is that the bank vault gives us a strong position. We can demonstrate responsible stewardship while asserting your legal rights. After ending the call, Sarah tried to sleep but found herself too agitated by the rapidly escalating situation. What had begun as a simple home renovation discovery was now becoming a media spectacle and legal battle with potential implications for national historical narratives. As she finally drifted towards sleep, Sarah found herself thinking about Thomas Fielding, the obscure clerk whose meticulous documentation of behind-the-scenes realities had remained hidden for centuries. What would he think about the controversy his words had unleashed in the modern world? Had he hidden these records, hoping they would eventually emerge and reveal a more complex truth about America's founding, or had he simply been documenting reality as he observed it, never imagining the potential impact? The next morning brought a flurry of activity. Attorney Rossi arrived at the hotel to brief Sarah on the emergency hearing, bringing formal clothes for her to wear to court. The girls would stay at the hotel with Diane Walker for their safety and privacy. The hearing is technically about temporary custody of the documents while ownership and access rights are determined, Rossi explained as they drove to the courthouse. But it will establish important precedents for the entire case. Judge Watkins is known for being thorough and fair-minded, which works in our favor. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and news cameras. Sarah kept her head down as Rossi guided her through the gauntlet of shouted questions and camera flashes. Inside, the assigned courtroom was already packed with observers, historians, legal observers, and what appeared to be government representatives. Dr. Harrison sat at the petitioner's table with two attorneys Sarah didn't recognize. He nodded stiffly in her direction as she entered. At the respondents' table, Sarah was surprised to find Professor Montgomery already seated alongside another attorney from Rossi's firm. The professor is here as an expert witness regarding historical significance and proper preservation, Rossi explained quietly. She's actually been very helpful in balancing the government's claims about necessary preservation measures. The hearing began promptly at 9 a.m. with Judge Watkins, a stern-looking woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and piercing eyes, establishing the parameters immediately. This court recognizes the potential historical significance of the materials in question, she began. However, I also recognize established legal principles regarding property rights and the rights of discoverers of historical artifacts. This hearing will focus narrowly on appropriate temporary custody, while fuller legal processes determine final disposition. Harrison's attorneys presented first, arguing that documents of such extraordinary national significance should be secured in the National Archives' specialized preservation facilities, while ownership and access rights were determined. They emphasized the government's unparalleled expertise in document preservation and the public interest in ensuring these potentially transformative historical materials received the highest standard of care. When Rossi's turn came, he presented a carefully constructed argument that acknowledged the document's significance while firmly asserting Sarah's rights. Your Honor, there is no dispute about the importance of proper preservation, he began. That's precisely why Ms. Mitchell has already secured these documents in a climate-controlled bank vault with museum-quality environmental controls and appropriate security measures. The question before the court is not whether these documents deserve protection, they unquestionably do, but whether removal from their current secure location and transfer to government custody is necessary or appropriate at this stage. He then called Professor Montgomery to testify about the current storage conditions, which she confirmed met professional preservation standards. Under cross-examination, she acknowledged that the National Archives had superior resources, but maintained that the current arrangement was more than adequate for temporary storage while legal questions were resolved. Throughout the proceedings, Sarah observed Dr. Harrison closely. His intensity suggested this was more than bureaucratic procedure to him. He seemed personally invested in securing these documents. During a brief recess, she mentioned this observation to Rossi. "I've noticed the same thing," he confirmed quietly. "It's unusual for someone at his level to be so directly involved in a case like this. Typically, the archives would send legal representatives without senior personnel attending personally. What do you think it means?" "I'm not certain," Rossi admitted, "but I suspect the content of these documents, particularly the references to founding financial arrangements, touches on areas of particular sensitivity. There may be concerns about how such revelations might be interpreted politically in the current climate." When the hearing resumed, Judge Watkins addressed several specific questions to both sides, focusing particularly on the chain of custody and current security arrangements. Her questions suggested she was taking a pragmatic approach rather than simply deferring to government authority. Finally, after nearly 3 hours of arguments and testimony, the judge rendered her decision. Having considered the evidence and arguments presented, this court finds that the historical documents discovered by Ms. Mitchell are currently maintained in appropriate preservation conditions that meet professional standards for temporary storage. While the court acknowledges the National Archives' superior permanent preservation capabilities, the petitioner has not demonstrated that immediate transfer to government custody is necessary to prevent degradation or damage. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her as the judge continued. Therefore, the court denies the petition for emergency transfer of custody. The documents shall remain in their current secure location at Burnfield Trust Bank, with access limited to Ms. Mitchell and her designated representatives pending further legal proceedings regarding final disposition and access rights. Judge Watkins then looked directly at Sarah. "Ms. Mitchell, the court recognizes your responsible handling of this significant historical discovery. Your actions in securing appropriate preservation while asserting your legal rights reflect a commendable balance between private interests and public historical value." The judge then established a schedule for the broader case regarding ownership and access rights, setting a full hearing for 30 days later. In the meantime, she ordered that a team of independent authentication experts be given access to evaluate the documents under neutral supervision. As they left the courtroom, Rossi was clearly pleased with the outcome. "This is an important first victory. Maintaining the status quo regarding physical custody strengthens our position significantly for the larger case about ownership and access rights." Sarah nodded, still processing the judge's words. The acknowledgement of her responsible handling had validated her approach, confirming that she was navigating this unexpected situation appropriately despite the pressure from powerful institutions. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed around them, shouting questions about the document's contents and significance. Rossi guided Sarah to a podium, where he had arranged for a brief statement. "Ms. Mitchell has acted as a responsible steward of historically significant materials discovered on her property," he stated to the assembled media. "Today's ruling confirms that these documents will remain secure while proper legal processes determine final arrangements regarding ownership and public access. Ms. Mitchell is committed to ensuring that any historical insights these documents may provide are properly preserved and shared according to appropriate scholarly and legal standards." As cameras flashed and reporters shouted follow-up questions, Sarah found herself thinking not about legal victories or media attention, but about her daughters waiting back at the hotel. They had supported her through this extraordinary situation, with remarkable maturity and insight, particularly Lily's observation about protecting the truth. Whatever the final outcome regarding ownership and access rights, Sarah was determined that the historical truth contained in Thomas Fielding's careful documentation would be preserved and shared appropriately, not hidden away again or sanitized to protect comfortable national mythologies. The clerk's long-hidden words deserve to contribute to a more complete, if more complex understanding of America's founding principles and the human realities behind them. The path ahead remained uncertain, with powerful interests invested in controlling the narrative these documents might present. But the court's recognition of Sarah's careful stewardship had reinforced her determination to ensure that after 2 centuries of silence, Thomas Fielding's observations would finally take their place in the historical record, revealing a more nuanced truth about the nation's founding that acknowledged both idealistic principles and practical economic realities. As they drove away from the courthouse, Sarah realized that in her own way, she had become a custodian not just of physical documents, but of historical truth itself, a responsibility she had never sought but now embraced fully, not despite but because of its complexity and significance. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.